Hello and welcome to another episode of Take the North. I'm Adam Studzinski. I produce this podcast, which is presented by Odyssey. I'm alongside Dan Wiederer of the Chicago Tribune. Mark Rohde has this episode off, a special mailbag episode to finish off NFL Combine Week. But Dan, one piece of actual news we should get to before we get into our mailbag. The big news that really came out of Combine Week was the Chiefs' plan to franchise tag star guard Trey Smith. So that franchise tag is going to be worth about $23.4 million. If he plays on it, they can still extend him. But that means in all likelihood, Trey Smith will not be available in free agency for a team like, say, the Bears to go out and get.
No question. Not shocking news, but it was a bit surprising when it surfaced on Thursday, because I think it was a little bit hard to read throughout the week which direction this was going. Brett Veach stood up at a podium on Tuesday and made it really clear that he had a high priority on Trey Smith and trying to find a way to keep him around in Kansas City. But some of the chatter around the league was Kansas City might not be able to afford it with all the balls that they have in the air, all the things they're juggling with a championship level roster and trying to keep that intact as much as possible. They obviously made their decision that Trey Smith was the top priority. As you mentioned, $23.4 million is the franchise tag in 2025 for an offensive lineman. You would guess that the Chiefs will work to get an extension done before the season begins, but this buys them time. And with all those other balls in the air, as we mentioned, a bunch of key starters with expiring contracts as well, this now gives Brett Veach an opportunity to kind of settle some of his other business and come back to this at some point in order to get Trey Smith locked up. For the Bears, it means they've got to go in a new direction. And obviously we know and have talked for weeks, if not months now, about the interior of that offensive line being such a high priority in this roster acquisition cycle. And so now you just take one name off your board and it's a top shelf free agent that comes off the board. But you're hopeful that Ryan Poles and Ben Johnson have the ability to gracefully pivot and find a way to add different makers up front, both in free agency and the draft.
Yeah, Dan, it was probably in all reality a pipe dream that Trey Smith was ever going to hit free agency. It's so rare that teams let really good linemen go. I mean, let really good players in general, but
no doubt.
Linemen especially almost never hit free agency. Certainly not after their rookie contracts, which Trey Smith is finishing up. So there are still guys out there that the Bears can target. Mekhi Becton could still hit free agency, but that remains to be seen. Drew Dahlman, the center out of Atlanta, is most likely to hit free agency. It seems like, and you mentioned this. I just want to touch on it real quick. The Kansas City Chiefs, their cap space is going to get tight real quick. So it is going to be really interesting to see how they work around this, whether they extend Trey Smith and kind of spread his cap out a little bit, or they can rework Patrick Mahomes' deal. Travis Kelce is coming back apparently, which means that they're going to have his cap hit, which I believe is around $19 million this year. So they got some work to do, but I mean, that's the problem that comes with success, right? So
no,
we'll see.
That's one of the ways that good players sometimes hit the market, is because a team just can't afford to pay everybody. And that's why the salary cap in the NFL functions the way it does. And so, the Bears would love to be in that situation one day where they have so many good players that they have to let some of them go. This is a different situation here. I think they've been very honest about the needs to add to the roster here coming up soon. And that clock is ticking. March 10th will get here before we know it. And the Bears will have some work to do pretty quickly to make some sort of an impact to adding to their roster. I will say this: I've got a lot of work to do. I got back from the combine late Thursday night, Studs, and this morning I looked in the mirror, a little gut that I wasn't used to, and I'm like, oh God, like the bourbon, the vodka, the steak, the pork chops, like it's gonna be a busy weekend for me to try to rectify some of my wrongs from the week in Indianapolis.
Go on a few runs. You'll be all right. Drink some water. I believe in you, Dan. So
thank you.
There's we'll keep an eye on obviously all this as we go along here and get towards free agency, like you said, is on March 10th. But definitely probably the biggest target for anyone that needed an offensive line this offseason is seemingly off the board. And we should note that it's possible the Chiefs trade him. So you're going to have to give up draft capital or players to get him in that case. But it's very likely he's just going to stay in Kansas City. So with that, we will get into our mailbag. So in case you forgot, you can directly message us on Twitter, whether that's at Dan Wiederer or at myself. I'm at Tristler Studs, and at our show Twitter account, that's at Take the North. You can also hit us up on Blue Sky. Dan, I believe you're on Blue Sky. I got to get the show on Blue Sky. I'm not personally on Blue Sky. Okay.
And I still have trouble with the handles. I get some good feedback on Blue Sky, but I still forget what my actual handle is on there because it's such a different terrain. It's at danwiederer.bsky.social. So that
okay.
That gives people an idea there where to find me.
Okay, great. So there you go. And we also have a Gmail, takethenorthpod@gmail.com. So we'll go ahead and dive into this. This question comes from Zach Rooting on Blue Sky. So since we were talking O-line to start off this particular episode, we'll stick with that theme. And a lot of these, I should note, are offensive line scheme. You know, you and Grody a couple episodes ago, Dan said a lot of talk is going to be on the offensive line over the next few weeks. So that's certainly been true. So anyway, Zach asks, what position in the O-line do you consider the biggest need?
I'm honestly just going to lump it all into one and say the interior, because I think you can find some guards that can play center for you, some centers that can play guard for you. And I think you just need to find some reliable difference makers up front that can create a firm pocket for Caleb Williams to take that year 2 jump. And so, look, I think the name you're going to hear most now that Trey Smith is off the board is center Drew Dahlman. He is going to probably make his way out of Atlanta on an expiring contract next week, in part because their salary cap is a mess. And so that's another way that guys get to free agency, and it's not all damaged goods when you go to that flea market. And so Drew Dahlman is a 26-year-old. He missed 8 games last year with an ankle injury, but is widely considered the top center on the market. You've got an opportunity here, you know, to really find someone that can become a little bit of a compass for Caleb Williams. I have been pretty consistent that I don't want to pair Caleb Williams with a rookie center, even if it is a highly drafted guy, you know, that you take in round 1 or round 2. I would prefer a developing quarterback with limited experience to have somebody in front of him that can help him with certain things, protection sets and everything else you need to do up front. And so, wouldn't be shocked at all if that becomes a major priority when free agency opens and Ben Johnson and Ryan Poles decide, hey, let's go get somebody to snap Caleb the football that's got a lot of experience, a lot of intelligence, and somebody that can really bolster the interior of that line.
Yeah, you know, Dan, I definitely agree with you. And in general, the interior is their biggest need. I will get specific and answer the question with I think their biggest need is center, and I just solidify that position. It's, you know, we were blessed in this town for a long time to have really good center play. Obviously, there was Olin Kreutz, and, you know, heck, man, you go back to the '85 Bears with Jay Hilgenberg. It was a great center. And then even after Olin Kreutz, you had Roberto Garza moved from
Garza
center, and Garza did really solid center, not necessarily as good as Olin, but pretty good. And since then, though, it's kind of been Cody Whitehair was okay, was better as a guard. And, you know, obviously the last couple of years, it's been totally in flux. So I really want, go get a guy like Drew Dahlman and just lock that position up. I think you're right. Like, I think you prefer not to have a rookie center, at least this coming year. And, give Caleb a veteran center who is going to be able to help him with the protection calls, most importantly. And I think that's going to help Caleb even more than just the experience he got last year. But, a guy that I don't think that I realized until this last year, maybe the year before that, how important center play is, even just for helping the quarterback. So I'm all in on getting a center, and I'm locked in on Drew Dahlman at this point.
No pushback on that, and Dahlman will be in the center of the radar. When you mentioned Garza, the first thing that comes to mind is that 2013 Bears team. That was my first year on the beat, and you remember that team set offensive records for Bears franchise milestones. And so you had an offensive line there. I think that was the only offensive line that I've ever covered that played the entire season together. And you had Bushrod, and you had Kyle Long as a rookie, and you had Matt Slauson, and you had Garza. I think Jordan Mills was your starter at right tackle. And that group really did create that dependability that's been lacking ever since on the offensive line, and then allowed your stars to be your stars, right? You had playmakers, and this group of playmakers that the Bears have and will add to is just desperate to get a group up front that can be reliable, steady, not changing the starting lineup every third day, and hopefully they can get something new unlocked.
So we'll go ahead and move on to our next question here. This one comes from Martin Dekelita, Dekelaaita. It's on Twitter. Sorry, Martin, if I butchered your name. But thanks for the question. So, will polls draft more players based on the field production as opposed to RAS scores this year? And for those who don't know, the RAS score is relative athletic score, which essentially takes your scores in the various aspects of the combine or your pro day, whether it's the 40 or the cone drill, and averages them out amongst your peers to give you how athletic you are on a scale of 1 to 10 compared to other players at your position. So
yeah, it's an analytical way.
Yes.
Yeah, an analytical way to kind of measure athletic traits and explosion. And as you mentioned, height, weight, speed, strength, athleticism. You get some of the testing scores in there, 40-yard dash, your 20-yard split, your 10-yard split. What does your 3-cone score look like? This is the age-old debate on, do you prioritize traits over tape or tape over traits? And it feels like in recent years, Ryan Poles and his group have been sort of attracted to the traits. They have drafted a bunch of guys with RAS scores that are very high and have these impressive displays of athleticism and explosion. And I just wonder how this will change a little bit with Ben Johnson in the fold. It's going to be really interesting to kind of watch what kind of input he has in some of these selections and how it maybe evolves over the last 3 years as they go into it. I've always been a tape over traits guy. I just feel like this is the game of football, and sometimes you can get mesmerized by the freak show that is the NFL in terms of how fast, how athletic, how high a guy jumps, and what's needed to succeed at the highest level of professional athletics. But a lot of times, if you just side with the guy who really, really plays football well, you win out. And we'll see which direction they go. But it's a really good question, because I do think that it speaks to some things that have happened in the past, and we're just going to kind of sit back and measure the evolution of that.
Yeah, I think that I think that RAS is something you can look at as a really good tool later in the draft, like 5th round and on, where you're looking for someone like, okay, this guy, could be a diamond in the rough. I think that Braxton Jones was a really good RAS. I think he had a really good RAS score. But when you're drafting earlier in the draft, I think you really have to look at the film more so than the stuff they do at the combine, more so than something like your RAS score. Because, look, Anthony Richardson for the Colts is somebody that everyone, I don't know I'm guessing his RAS score is huge. I don't have it in front of me, but he's a guy that you look at, he's like, man, he's got all the traits. But if you went back and you watched his college film, I remember going like, okay, I don't know if he's any good at playing quarterback.
Right. and that's a different position too, right? Like that's a position where like Tom Brady has a historically awful RAS score, right? And is obviously the best to ever play the position. And so that RAS score will factor in differently at specific positions. You obviously don't want to get a Tom Brady type playing corner for you,
exactly.
But
quarterback's probably not the best example. Yeah.
But I'm with you, because when I think back to my early years covering the Vikings, I remember I had gotten some pre-draft intel that the Vikings were really, really interested in Harrison Smith. And I remember I wrote it like a week before the draft, and I got so much pushback from people being like, Harrison Smith, are you kidding me? Like, he can't play safety. He's too slow. He needs to be a linebacker. His test scores are this. He ran this. And then after he was drafted by the Vikings, there were people in that front office that said, just watch. Like, if you're worried about those, 2 to 3 tenths of a second on his 40 time, well, he makes that up with 0.5 seconds earlier diagnosis. He makes that up before the snap of understanding what he's seeing and cheating over 3 yards to what he knows is coming. And obviously Harrison Smith may have just finished a potential Hall of Fame career in Minnesota because he had the tape and the football IQ and the feel for the game that takes what is considered by some to be middle of the road athletic traits, and he turned them into something that could be an impact career for more than a decade.
And just one quick note, because I know that's someone whose name is going to come up really based on RAS score coming out of the combine, is a guy like Shamar Stewart out of Texas A&M, who's one of these guys that, like, man, the athletic traits are off the charts, but the production lacks. I think he had 4.5 sacks in 3 years at A&M, which is, it's like, okay, if you're this athletic, where's the production? Now they did measure a lot. He had, I think, 39 pressures his last year at A&M, which is pretty good. But it's like, hey, that's a guy that you're really taking a risk because you watch the film and it's like, okay, but he's super athletic. So that's the kind of thing that you run into. So that will be really interesting to watch this year. Is, like you said before, Ben Johnson is here now, and how do they balance that with a new head coach? So we'll go to our next question here. This next one is from Brent. This is on Blue Sky. Brent asks us, what are your feelings on drafting a Jeanty with the number 10 pick? Let's say the Bears are unable to get any good O-line help in free agency. So in this scenario, they haven't signed, let's say, a starter-worthy free agent on the offensive line, and Jeanty's available at number 10. Yes or no?
I love the conversation. I'm all in for the conversation because I think this is a special football player. I think where you run into trouble if you're the Bears is that you have so many bigger needs and it feels like a luxury buy. At the same time, when you're picking in the top 10, you want to look back in like 5 to 8 years with zero regrets and know that you got an absolute impact football player with the pick you took. And I think Ashton Jeanty is an absolute impact football player. So you talk to people around the combine this week, Studs, and there are people in the league that think he might be one of the top 4 players in this draft class. If you get one of the top 4 players in this draft class at number 10, and he's going to be special at a playmaking position, you can justify it, right? You can definitely justify it. Probably a luxury item with everything that we've talked about with the lines, but it's also a year where you can address the line in free agency. You can address the line later in the draft. The other argument against Jeanty is that this running back class is really deep, and people around the league are like, look, like there are going to be guys picked on day 2 and early day 3 that 5 years from now we're going to look back and go like, yeah, that was a value pick, and you got an absolute stud for your backfield without having to pay a premium price for it. And so that's the debate here. I go back to the same conversation we had a couple of years ago with Bijan Robinson, and you just like, sometimes a player is special enough to, defy what the positional guidelines normally say. And I think Ashton Jeanty is that type. Studs, the Bears had 3 runs this past season of longer than 25 yards. 3 runs of longer than 25 yards. They were all DeAndre Swift touchdowns, 36 yards against the Rams, the 56-yarder, as we all remember, against Washington to spark that comeback, and then a 39-yarder against the Packers. Ashton Jeanty, obviously apples to oranges here, college versus pros, had 9 games in which he had a run of 50 yards or longer. So you talk about a guy that's just explosive as all get out, unbelievable speed, unbelievable vision, contact balance, all the things you look for in the position, potentially uniting with Ben Johnson, who obviously did wonderful things with Jahmyr Gibbs. And you say, yeah, I can see the intrigue. I probably don't do it at 10. I probably don't, as we sit here, in late February, early March and talk about it. But again, I'm all for the conversation.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you said, Dan. In a scenario where you're going into the draft where you haven't necessarily been able to get an impact guy on the upfront in free agency, even if in that scenario, if they took Ashton Jeanty, I know that people will be like, "Oh, why didn't he take an offensive lineman?" And like, well, I'm not disappointed. Like I wouldn't be disappointed if they did it. It's like you said, though, I wouldn't do it personally. Like if I'm Ryan Poles, I probably wouldn't do it. Now, in a scenario where, like, let's say you have gotten a couple good offensive linemen in free agency, and you come up to the board at number 10, and Ashton Jeanty sitting right there for you. As you were saying, I think he's a special player.
Yeah.
And I think you can sell that pick to your fans, to your team, certainly. Like, I don't think anyone disagrees that we think Ashton Jeanty is going to be a really, really good impact player. And it would be very tough to pass on a guy like that. And that also brings in the conversation of drafting for need versus drafting the best player available.
Right.
And there's a delicate balance there. If you've built your team the right way, you can just draft the best player available because you don't have critical needs at various places. I don't know if the Bears are in the luxury spot of being able to just take the best player on their board or the best player objectively on the board. And, we'll see how that plays out after free agency. But I agree. Ashton Jeanty would be fun. It would, we would have to see how the offensive line plays out. I don't think that they're in the position to do it. And like I said, if I'm Ryan Poles, I don't think I'm doing it.
The tape is exhilarating. And that when you talk about the fun part of it, I would never recommend that Ryan Poles and Ian Cunningham and their staff view the pre-draft process like our audience would, but our audience should spend some time on the Ashton Jeanty tape here in the next 5 or 6 weeks, because once you're done looking at Tyler Booker's hand placement on the interior offensive line, you're going to get an adrenaline rush by putting on like 7 to 8 minutes of Ashton Jeanty tape and watching some of the big play explosion he has. And so we'll see where it goes. It look like there are years where I just immediately shoot down the running back argument and the using premium resources on it. This isn't one of those years, and so I welcome this conversation, and I know that it's going to go mainstream here really, really soon here in Chicago, and so we're right out in front of it thanks to that question.
Exactly. So thank you for the question. And like you said, Jeanty's film was incredible. It was the fact that you said he had 9 games with 50+ yard runs. I mean, that's basically every game. It's basically every game. He's like guaranteed to have a 50-yard run. It was insane to watch. So we'll move on to our next question here, Dan. So this one comes from Twitter, Jim De Altario. I believe I said that right. And so Jim asked us, why did Poles take an average offensive right tackle instead of Jalen Carter? Thank you for your score hits. So I got a lot to say about this one. I'll let you go first.
No, I was going to say, I know you have a lot to say about this, and so I'm going to let you go first. You're welcome for my score hits, but now we're going to turn the floor over to Studs, and I'll circle back to square the circle or whatever it may be.
So here's I got a couple issues with the Jalen Carter conversation that continues to pop up. And look, I understand he has become a phenomenal player on a Super Bowl champion. I understand why the conversation is there. What bugs me about it is if we rewind a couple years and we remember the conversation and the things that we were talking about with Jalen Carter leading up to that draft. This is a guy who had legal problems for a traffic incident in which a teammate of his died. And he had to leave the combine to go take care of to go make a court appearance back in Georgia.
2023. Yep.
Yes. And then you fast forward to his pro day where he looked out of shape, couldn't finish the drills. He looked awful, as bad of a pro day as you're going to see. And I understand, look, there's the film also spoke for itself. Going into that draft, I remember thinking, okay, I know the film looks great, but none of this looks good to me. And I think he's still going to be a pretty damn good player, but I don't think I don't feel good about it. And even when he was on the board when the Bears came up to that pick, which at the moment was number 9, I was like, I was on the edge of my seat. Like, I don't know. Do they do it or not? And they ended up, obviously we know they trade back a pick with the Eagles. Eagles take Carter, Bears take Darnell Wright. Here's the other thing. Average right tackle is not a good descriptor for Darnell Wright. Darnell Wright is a good player. He is a good tackle. Don't let the other problems on the offensive line distract you from that. He is a good player who I think can be even better with better coaching and with a better scheme. Plus, you have to remember he played hurt some of the year last year and still managed to put out some pretty damn good film. So I'm not here for the Darnell Wright at his average talk. He's on a scale of who's better at their position. Of course, Jalen Carter is better at their position. If you're going to ask me which player would you rather have right now, okay, fine. Yeah, you probably would. You're going to say Jalen Carter. But you remember everything that had to go into that. There are people like Lawrence Holmes on the score who was saying, I still would have taken Jalen Carter. So if you're one of those people that was always saying, take Jalen Carter, take Jalen Carter, take Jalen Carter, okay, fine. But other than that, And all right, I got one last thing to say on this before I let you go, Dan. There's all these people, fans, media personalities that have been screaming for the last 2 years, build the offensive line, build the offensive line, build the offensive line. Well, Ryan Poles took a tackle at number 10 overall, and now there's people that aren't happy about it. And it's just like, it's so weird to me. Like, what do you make up your minds here? It's just like, oh, we want an offensive line, but not like that. Not a number 10 overall. And I understand like all that goes into that, but it just makes me crazy because I still am okay with the fact that Darnell Wright is on this team. He's like, the fact is he is the only good offensive lineman on this team. He's the only one that you put him out there and you're like, yeah, he can do his job pretty well. And I think is going to get even better this next year. Okay.
We have to get a sponsor for every Stud's passion rant because they're always energizing and full of life when we get here. I'm with you on most of it. The conversation has to be framed as you just did it there at the end on this wasn't a question of yes or no on Jalen Carter. It was, do you want Jalen Carter over what your other options are? Ultimately, the Bears decided, hey, we've got multiple positions of need. And while we do acknowledge that Jalen Carter has all pro potential and could be a major impact player in the league, we are leaning in towards what we think is more of a sure thing at a position that we know we need. And so they went with Darnell Wright. I did a lot of reporting on this on that weekend of the draft weekend and wrote a big story on the Sunday of that draft weekend about all the things that went into both the attraction to Darnell Wright and kind of the repellent from Jalen Carter. As you mentioned, he was cited for misdemeanor counts of racing and reckless driving in that gnarly car accident situation down in Athens, Georgia, that took the lives of 2 young people, including one of his teammates. He showed up at his pro day, overweight, out of breath, cramped up, and ultimately cut the pro day short. When you are investing a premium pick in the draft at that spot on the draft board, you don't want to have anxiety in your belly. You want to have nothing but excitement. And the Bears had the anxiety in their belly. The Eagles, by contrast, saw, and Howie Roseman said it on draft weekend, we believe we just got ourselves an impact player. They sure did. And they also felt like they could take that risk because they were coming off of a Super Bowl appearance. Howie Roseman had been in the league for 15 years. He had been in a Super Bowl parade, and then in that year, obviously, just played in the Super Bowl. He had built up enough credibility to roll those dice and take that risk. Ryan Poles wasn't there with the construction of his roster, wasn't there with where he was at going into his second draft as a GM. Was it, in retrospect, the wrong pick? Probably, because Jalen Carter looks like he's on his way to the Hall of Fame if he continues to play for the rest of his career like he did this past season. There's a lot that goes into that, and that's sort of where the risk aversion equation comes into play, and the Bears are going to have to play around with that. I'm going to read you a quote that kind of flew under the radar this week from Indianapolis from Ben Johnson, and it has nothing to do with what we're talking about right now, but it has everything to do with what we're talking about right now. And this was Ben Johnson talking, Studs, about the process inside the building at Haugh Hall of outlining what exactly they want from each position and what they're going to be chasing in the talent acquisition period. And this is Ben Johnson, quote, we very clearly outlined what the ideal look will be in terms of attributes, height, weight, speed, in terms of makeup, which is of critical importance for what we're looking for. But at the same time, if it's a good football player, we're going to make it work as a coaching staff. So there's a balance going on with that. And I read that because this wasn't somebody that just said 130%, we are going to lean into makeup. It was, we really are going to prioritize makeup, but if we see a really good football player as a coaching staff, we're going to make it work. And I kind of like the philosophy there. I wonder what it would have done to Ben Johnson's train of thought if he was in charge of picking for the Bears 2 years ago at number 9 and Jalen Carter was still available. Remember, the Lions were one of the teams that passed on Jalen Carter in that draft. Seattle, most notably at number 5. You mentioned Anthony Richardson earlier. The Colts leaned in the direction of a quarterback there at a time where they needed one. But there were a lot of teams that passed on Jalen Carter. The Lions ended up trading back. I don't think it was the same pick, but that's the draft where they got Jahmyr Gibbs and Jack Campbell. And so interesting, right? Like the idea that, okay, like if there is somebody that's a little bit risky, if they are really, really good at football, maybe we're going to just say, hey, coaches, let's figure this out and let's make sure we create the infrastructure. Philly obviously had a couple of Jalen Carter's old Georgia brothers there, and Kobe Dean and Jordan Davis, and then ultimately fell into Nolan Smith later in that same draft. They were able to put him in a organization that had been winning already and had a firm nucleus established. Also okay with this conversation, because I do think that it is good to have, and it is good to have on an ongoing basis, as long as you said revisionist history isn't applied, because you cannot get in the cold tub time machine, which is trademarked by the Take the North podcast, and take yourself back to that place and forget all of the things that were swirling around Jalen Carter when the draft arrived in 2023.
Right, exactly. And one last thing about this before we have one last really quick fun question here. I'm glad you mentioned Ben Johnson, and because there was a quote I wanted to bring up, another quote from him that I wanted to bring up inside of this discussion. It says, I don't know if this is a different interview than the one you were quoting, because he did 100 different ones, but this is the one he did with Cassie. This is from the interview he had with Cassie Carlson of Fox 32 in Chicago. Quote, I see Darnell Wright very much in the same mold as Penei Sewell. We tried to do things the last 3 years in Detroit to highlight Sewell in space, highlight him on one-on-one blocks, him against their best defensive lineman. I see the same thing in Darnell. So now that's not exactly him comparing the two, but it is him saying that he thinks he can use Darnell Wright in a similar way, which is high praise. So like
very high praise.
Yes, Ben Johnson clearly has seen some good things in Darnell Wright. So that's why I just want to say, like, calling him an average right tackle is in my mind not accurate. So
well, and like, look, like this conversation, it dovetails with the Jeanty one, because it looked like when you're picking where the Bears are picking, like the bottom line bar that you need to clear is you need to sign that player to a second contract, right? Like that's got to be a second contract starter for you. And so like that has to be the minimum. And that's where you want to set that bar and make sure you can feel good on draft night and for every year of the first 3 years of that player's career that you're on that trajectory. And we'll see kind of how that factors in as the Bears, again, picking in the top 10 one more time in this draft coming up next month.
All right. We got one more question here on this mailbag episode, Dan. Simple one. Can we do a Dan/Grody/Studs AMA when it slows down during the off season? I don't know about you, but I'm in it if we can make it work.
Yeah. And AMA stands for Ask Me Anything. I'm in. Like, I like, particularly during the off season, when we've got some time to riff a little bit, ask us anything. It's fun to learn a little bit more about my brothers on the Take the North podcast. I want some of these questions to come in. I want them to be off the wall. I want them to be non-football related, and we'll see where we can go with some of it. So I'm all for that suggestion. Whoever made that one, I'm in.
Sorry, that's Adam Anderson was the who
Adam, I'm in.
So yeah, Adam,
send as many as you got, and we'll file them away.
We'll definitely have time, especially once we get past the draft and get into late May, June. We're gonna need something. So yeah, I think we can definitely make that work. So Dan, anything else before we get out of here today?
No, I mean, we're going to have a little small bridge to cross here. Obviously, combine drill still going on in Indianapolis, and then it'll be a very, very short period next week as the Bears ramp up for free agency and get ready to see what they can do there. I will say this as we get out of here, because I know we're going to preview this more extensively next week, but it's always interesting when free agency gets close to feel like you're entering the Super Bowl, right? Like it just feels like it's got that big game aura to it. The vibes are there. And you always have to remember that free agency is just a way to supplement the roster. And it's just not what it feels like in the moment. And I think Ryan Poles again reiterated that this week, where he said, look, like, like the urge and the adrenaline kind of provokes you to want to be a major player in it, but you have to retain that selectivity and that discipline and make sure that you're not just making reckless decisions because it feels good in the moment. So that's the challenge that some of these front offices face, and that's coming up on the Bears really soon.
Yeah. You don't want to look. You can find good players in free. Hell, the Bears got Julius Peppers in free agency, right? Like you can find really good players in free agency, but it's bargain shopping a lot. So buyer beware, right? That's the lesson. It was Ryan Pace who always said that it's a landmines, full of landmines, right?
Yep.
So gotta watch out, and we'll be there every step of the way on the Take the North podcast for Dan Wiederer of the Chicago Tribune and Mark Grody of 670 The Score, who is off today. I am Adam Studzinski. I produce the Take the North podcast presented by Odyssey. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Great talk. Great week. See you out there.